and then I'll hand it over. Kate Doyle, Rutgers University, Newark, New Jersey. Not too far away from me. On paradox, inaudible music, and laws of form in experimental art. Kate Doyle is an assistant professor of music in the Department of Arts, Culture, and Media at Rutgers University, Newark. Her writing and engaged scholarship explores the performance and ideas of music in conceptual and experimental art practice, particularly through cybernetic frameworks. She works actively within the American Society for Cybernetics and has been an invited speaker or collaborator at the Library of Congress, the University of Arts Chelsea College, the DIA, or is it DIA? DIA Art Foundation, and the Festival of Original Theater. So take it away, Kate. It's all yours.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can everyone see just the slides, not my whole screen?
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
Thanks.
Yes.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Trying something new. Hi, I'm Kate Doyle. I'm disappointed I can't be with you in Liverpool, but happy to be joining virtually from my home in New York City. I'll begin with two pieces by the sculptor Richard Serra. The first is Tilted Arc, constructed in 1981 and placed in New York City's Federal Plaza. It's about 3.5 meters high and made of rusted steel. It was removed in 1989 because members of the community working around the plaza were unhappy at the obstruction to their walking paths.
It was a distinction. For sure.
The second is Contour, constructed in 2004. It currently lives at Glenstone, an exhibition space in a suburb of Washington, D.C. These are forms that lack a consonance. They appear as open. And though Serra once said that many of his forms reminded him of Mobius strips, even works like Sequence, seen here, contain an opening for observers to enter. What I want to explore in this talk are the distinctions that we create in conversation with forms of art, specifically what we make of what seems to be absent or lacking. Through a listener-observer's act of making distinctions, the form becomes circular and complete. I was interested and glad to hear a discussion during the lunch break today about the ways that different people with different bodies of knowledge use laws of form, the diverse ways in which its language is adopted and employed. So here I want to acknowledge my position as a listener-observer of things, of George Spencer Brown's laws of form, of art objects, including musical ones, of entities I experience in what we call the world. I regard my position, my knowing, as open, as encompassing of absence or lack, just as the art forms I will consider are. And as I do in the case of these forms, I also regard my position in relation to things, including the laws of form, as becoming. Serra's rusted steel cuts the space of the plaza and the field. Its insertion causes changes to occur. Movement patterns adapt. The people in the plaza must walk in different ways. The environment adapts. New growth in the field emerges around the steel. Because of the distinction that Serra marks, the space becomes dynamic. It is becoming. What is the art here? The slice of rusted steel, the space around it, the people walking in this space. What is the form that we are to observe, and what is not? These questions emergent from Serra's work resonate an issue that has saturated art and music history or criticism since its beginnings, which is that we speak and write primarily about what is what we call present. We situate our discussion in a work's perceived morphological parameters, material type and quality, shape and size, volume or dynamic, rhythm, duration. What is absent lacks discussion because we lack language with which to discuss it. There are notable exceptions. Tutorials on the practice of sketching in negative space. Chungwan Chang's and others' translation of space within the brushstrokes of the Taoist painters as vacancy. The definitions of certain deities in Hindu or Buddhist art. Page is writing on silence. I have found Yoko Ono's approach to void and absence through the Fluxus invented instruction or event scores as particularly useful, likely because of its simple, action-oriented prose and processual structure. Here's an example, which Ono includes in the music score section of her Grapefruit collection, first published in Japan in 1964. Ono conflates cognitive function with material phenomenon, forgetting coincides with the diminuendo in sound. Where has the form gone? It has already shifted location from an external domain to the listener's consciousness. What the sound form has become and is becoming is unclear. If we think of the bell as a form with fixed boundaries, we must find ways to account for its change. In other words, Ono situates absence in process. This situation is perhaps why it is especially powerful that Ono chooses to present her exercise as a musical idea. Music usually constructs the reality of an event unfolding in what we call time. Many composers have challenged the typical temporalities of music, particularly linear structures. Fewer composers have challenged the nature of form itself. Ono frequently does, as does the 19th century composer Robert Schumann. I want to turn to a piece from Schumann's repertoire as example. This is the second movement of his Humoreske for solo piano, opus 20, written in 1839. The movement is titled Hastig, hastily. With no requisite of the ability to read European concert music notation, you can see that this movement features a rather unusual musical construction. Schumann uses 3 staves and he places the primary melody on the middle or second staff. Above it, he writes inner voice. He thus renders the principal melodic motive around which the theoretical structure of the movement unfolds inaudible. Actually, excuse me, in this particular edition, it's below the middle staff, the marking of inner voice. As the pianist Charles Rosen notes, nothing indicates that the melody is to be played. What we hear of the motive are fragments in quickly moving material, notated on the top and bottom staves, played by the pianist's right and left hands, or what Rosen calls a kind of after resonance, the echo of an unperformed melody. I'll play the beginning of this movement for you now. This is a recording by Radu Lupu from 1983. The bizarreness of this presentation of the musical theme is compounded at measure 17, when for 1 bar, Schumann leaves a notation of the middle staff blank. The melody becomes visually as well as aurally absent until measure 18, where it returns an image only. This construction has been approached in a variety of ways. Sometimes it's called Augen music or eye music, a musical score with a purpose of visual rather than oral interest. Some pianists attempt to play the inaudible melody in a show of virtuosity. To do so requires a great stretching of the hand. Rosen, who dismisses both of these approaches, calls Schumann's erasure of the notation in measure 17 a poetic joke. This descriptor is not meant to be dismissive, however. He argues that Schumann's employment of absence and erasure is extensive to the point that it functions as a kind of manifesto, one centered in a quintessentially romantic paradox of exploring music's materiality by erasure. Schumann, in other words, makes form present through absence. It's difficult to articulate such an idea. The innovation of this particular argument of Rosen's, which he integrates unbelabored in an introduction to a book on pianism in the Romantic era, is rarely cited or discussed, and I wonder if it is often missed by many brilliant performers and scholars who use the text as a frequent guide. To understand his point, we have to recognize that contradiction and paradox is what provides clarity in Schumann's work. We have to shift our thinking about what musical form and form in general is, to see it as something not static but dynamic, not as being but becoming, to change the language we use to describe art. I think that doing so would bring enormous value to conversation about art objects, including musical ones. And I want to suggest that one of the most powerful guides we can draw upon is Spencer Brown's laws of form. Let's return to the Serre work. Serre creates space in the plaza and field by inserting a curve of metal. He sets places into being by drawing a distinction. This is, of course, exactly what Spencer Brown instructs us to do. A mark has been made, an indication. If we were to place the mark, then place it again, the value of the mark would be the same. If we were to cross the mark, then cross it again, we move from marked space to unmarked space and back. The value of the second crossing would not equal the value of the first. It is from the second law, the law of crossing, that the potential for a recursiveness exists. Here, Francisco Varela found what Umberto Maturana calls the imaginary spatial dimension of time. Varela says, when Spencer Brown introduces re-entry and arrives at an expression equivalent to its content, what we call a self-cross, he notes its disconnection with his arithmetic and thus chooses to interpret it as an imaginary state in the form seen in time as alternation of the two states of the form. This interpretation is, in my opinion, one of his most outstanding contributions. He succeeds in linking time and description in a most natural fashion. This linking of time and description is what we are after in our consideration of art objects and absent art objects. We usually think of time in relation to art as the temporality of the form. But with Spencer Brown's calculus, as explained by Varela, we can think of time in relation to form's existence, or rather to its becoming as form. It becomes through paradox or contradiction between marked and unmarked states. We can understand the spatial dimension becoming similarly. As I was reminded during Luke Coffin's introduction to laws of form on Wednesday afternoon, Spencer Brown instructs us to, quote, call the space cloven by any distinction, together with the entire content of the space, the form of the distinction, and to, quote, call the law of the first distinction the form. What we may regard as absence is indeed form, the form of the work. And now we have the foundation of a means, a language to describe it. This is also where the act of indication, the making of a mark, establishes the role of the listener-observer as integral to the becoming of the form, where perceivable boundary and void become one by way of distinction. We might consider the role of the listener-observer's distinction-making in a work by the artist Christine Kozlov. This work, Information No Theory, was first exhibited in 1970 at the New York Cultural Center as part of the exhibition Conceptual Art and Conceptual Aspects. Kozlov displayed the piece as a reel-to-reel tape recorder encased and sitting on the floor, with a microphone lying on top of the case. On the wall beside these objects was a text reading, "The recorder is equipped with a continuous loop tape. For the duration of the exhibition, the tape recorder will be set at record. All the sounds audible in this room during that time will be recorded. The nature of the loop tape necessitates that new information erases old information. The life of the information, that is, the time it takes for the information to go from new to old, is approximately 2 minutes." And she writes a fourth point that is cut off here. Proof of the existence of the information does in fact not exist in actuality, but is based on probability. The objects indicate a continuous documentation of sounds present in the room by the running of the tape and the visual significance of the microphone. The document confirms this explanation, but relays a catch. Because of the function of the recording mechanism, all sound recorded will be erased. A contradiction is established. Clarity comes by the point of distinction, where the old tape becomes the new. The change sets up a conceptual orientation for the listener observer. It establishes a framework for understanding. By pointing to a distinction, Kozlov is able to compose absence out of presence and nothing out of something. Consider Barry Flanagan's film A Hole in the Sea, first exhibited as part of the Land Art TV exhibition broadcast by Berlin Public Television in 1969. Flanagan's piece is similarly centered around a mark of distinction. Here it is in the oscillating flow of the tide. The indicating mark, a circle or hole, organizes the observer's attention to a form that seems to defy time and boundary, the sea. In a plain space, a circle draws a distinction, Spencer Brown says. The whole serves to readjust our vision and prompts us to ask, what is? Flanagan arranges for a performance of the distinction in time through the presentation of the image over film. We can find a different arrangement of a related distinction making in another work, Nancy Holt's 1973, Holes of Light. The light moves from one hole to the next, behind and beyond the edge of the wall. With each iteration of the hole, it transforms, and the marking of the hole, the perceived absence, allows this transformation to occur. The piece becomes as the holes of light move through and beyond the wall. Here I want to return to Schumann, to another of his compositions. This excerpt is from an early work, Variations on the name Abweg, named for Schumann's probably at least semi-fictitious dedicatee, Countess Pauline von Abweg. The composer places the name Abweg into the work as a musical motto, using the pitches A, B flat, E, G, and G. In the last pages of the piece, however, Schumann employs the motto in a rather unusual way. The pitches are played together as a chord, one by one, then released. Schumann articulates his motto by its erasure. I'm going to play a video of what I find to be a particularly wonderful performance of this piece by the pianist Sarah Danishpour at the Arthur Rubinstein competition several years ago. I'll start shortly before the moment we are discussing. You'll likely recognize when we come to it from the gesture of the pianist's hand. You see Danishpour's fingers lift as the pitches are released. It's a gorgeous moment, and we could talk about form in lots of ways in listening to and looking at this performance. This is the case also in the Humoreske. When Schumann marks the principal melody inaudible and places fragments of it in following accompanimental material, he interrupts a musical logic. The situation of hearing an echo before its origin confuses a listener both spatially and temporally. If we approach this composition through Spencer Brown's idea, however, we can put aside a reliance on the linear frameworks that situate the development of musical form only through forward motion. Instead, we may see the form as circular, as a perpetual cycle in which the absence or void is part of what needs attention. Schumann's logic, his indication of something that is without yet being, comes to make morphological sense. The cybernetician Larry Richards has written that by creating a new starting point, that is, drawing distinctions, George Spencer Brown took a departure from the logic of causality by shifting the focus from entities and their relations to distinctions and their dynamics. Richards has also suggested that the arts hold a particular power to illuminate such dynamics. I now want to resonate the potential of Spencer Brown's departure for the understanding of experimental artworks like Schumann's Humoreske, which clearly interrupt the logic of causality, as well as a vast collection of works like Information No Theory, A Hole in the Sea, and Holes of Light. And though a shift in framework is perhaps especially important for the historically subversive work that denies ready language, I contend that it is also important for conversations about work that we might define as traditional, that which some conceptual and experimental artists have worked against. My logic in arguing for such a shift comes from my feeling that we may also be experimental in our reception of artworks and art objects, including musical ones. We are in conversation with the art objects we perceive, and we create meaning through a reception that is dynamic and oscillating, that moves and shifts. Through our making of distinctions, we construct and reconstruct the work and our relationship to it. The reception of art becomes an act of transcending the limits of what we call possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. Yeah, we have some time for questions. Let me start with William Brickett. Go ahead, William.
Sorry, I was on mute. I don't have a question. I was just applauding.
Oh, okay.
Thanks.
We got one right here from a pianist. Oh, thanks, Kate. That was great. I've got a question about wholeness and the extent to which the examples that you've shown us are wholes, and perhaps the decision, the artistic decision as to where to stop. Because, I mean, the last example, the Schumann, is a brilliant example of stopping perhaps where you wouldn't expect to stop. But what if he hadn't stopped there? What if you just cut it in half? Would that still be, what kind of mark would that be? What's the difference? And then what's the difference if the wall thing, what if that was shorter? Or what if it was longer? What are the differences between those kinds of distinctions? What's the artistic choice that's made as to how that distinction as to what kind of a distinction you're making is made?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a wonderful question. And, you know, I should have been more clear. The recording I played was an excerpt from the piece, but the piece does go on. So not long, but he does continue it, and it ends in a more, let's say, what we might call traditional way. But I think that the question that you make is wonderful to consider here, even in light of the adjustment I've just made to what you've said. So what I like in particular about the Schumann Humoreske, which was composed 9 years after the variations, the Abegg variations, is that Schumann begins to develop this way of sort of flipping things, of really not just exploring erasure, but as kind of exploring the rearrangement of time. So in the Humoreske, instead of just erasing a motto or leaving the melody absent, he places fragments of this melody, again, around which the structure of the piece is theoretically built. He places fragments of that melody in the left and right hand parts, which is sort of accompaniment material. So we don't recognize it as that unless you intimately knew the score or were looking at the score. But he subverts our expectations. He subverts the sort of definition of expectation. So he's putting this material here in later, and it's supposed to be a kind of echo, probably, but we've never heard the origin in the first place. So I think we can think about to tend to your question a little more directly, I think we can think about wholes and wholeness in terms of what our existing frameworks are, in terms of what our expectations are, and in terms of what Maturana called the imaginary spatial dimension of time. So these dimensions of space and time that we imagine. Schumann, I don't know all the reasons that he did what he did. I mean, I think he was an extremely experimental composer. We don't often think of experimental composers as working until the later 20th century, but Schumann was doing all kinds of wildly subversive things with form. I think for him, it was more literary, and he was interested in exploring contradiction and paradox, absolutely, as inspired by literary forms that he read. But I think he was messing with or exciting our ideas of wholeness in terms of expectation.
There's another question back here. Sahu? Just wanted to firstly obviously say thank you so much for presenting your work. And I think that it was really exciting to hear you talk about Fluxus and Yoko Ono. And I was wondering if, of course, maybe I missed this part, whether you consider Cage, John Cage, of course, Silence, 4 minutes and 33 seconds, and how that, is really marks, at least in a certain canonical sense, it marks this sort of shift where you're framing the empty score, the blank score. And he has different versions of this score, of course, inspired by paintings as well, just blank paintings. So I'm thinking about the empty duration of like 4 minutes and 33 seconds, having David Tudor perform a piano. I mean, he's a pianist, but also a brilliant circuit designer and things. So I wonder whether that is, so I had one question about John Cage, of course, in that history. And then the second question is, or curiosity is about Alvin Lucier and the work I'm Sitting in a Room, which also is really using feedback and the microphone, whatever's going in, the words that are coming out of my mouth is going into the microphone, then that goes through the speakers, and the speakers play the sound through the space, and then that space is recording it again through the microphone, and it's going out of the speaker again. So you have this whole feedback situation happening, and then you start listening to the room, which is a medium of really the where the sound is moving. So I think that at least thinking about Alvin Lucier as a good example of like a re-entering form in art, and especially with sound. So I'm just curious if you considered that, or if that is related in some sense to this notion of absence in sound and music as a kind of a void or yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Those are such wonderful questions and comments. So Cage was so, his points were so important in thinking about the idea of silence, and also the falsity of silence, which we talk about a lot when he goes into the chamber, and then the story about how he's pursuing silence and finds that he can't really find it. But then he also talks about it in different ways in terms of concept, and importantly, he the piece with David Tudor really challenges the expectations, and specifically expectations of the concert setting. And so I think we have to think a lot about the artists at that time in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, pushing back against what it means to go to a concert hall and attend a concert. And same with Alvin Lucier. But of course, they're doing lots of different things with space, with exploring, again, the idea of silence, and with the possibility of it in terms of just our auditory system and our biology. I like to talk about Ono. Firstly, because, but not firstly, I'll start with secondly, because she is often not discussed in this way, especially in comparison to Cage. But I think that Ono was extremely important because firstly, she thought about silence in a very, she thought about sound and about the concept of sound in a very conceptual way. So she considered not silence, really not silence so much at all, but sound in concept. So that was her brilliance, I think, as a composer. And if you look through the music scores of that are in Grapefruit and some other scores that are throughout the book, you'll find that she deals with sound just in what she calls it music of the mind. And she deals with sound and music in the mind in a very sort of process oriented way. So the specificity of that, the process of that she lays out, I find extremely helpful and really totally unique at the time in terms of how we deal with the idea of music and with the material of music.
Thank you, Kate. There are actually burning questions in this room. We're totally over time and because of some important things coming up, we really can't push anymore, but I think I'm gonna let these two questions just be voiced in less than 20 seconds each. Do you think it's an experiment? Okay, I'm gonna hold one and then two, and the third 20 seconds.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. I thought about the first example you gave, which is Sarah again, and the comment that it's a distinction, but then or placing a mark in this place. And I found it quite beautiful to think about the definition that distinction is perfect continence. And maybe that's a good description of artworks in general.
All right, very good. Okay, that's the first one. Okay, now you do it.
I'll add on to that a bit on the tilted arc. And I think John Miller, the art critic, the October art critic, makes a convincing point that when the workers get together and democratically elect to remove the tilted arc, it's actually a very powerful democratic statement. So their absence of it is a very interesting thing. On top of that, because they are the observers, they're actually kind of refusing some of the egotistic conceptual artists.
All right. Do you want to respond to that in a similar amount of time?
Sure, 2-second response.
Yeah.
I think it's a fabulous definition that you suggested, response to the first question, comment. And the second one, yes, I agree. And it's a way of continuing the process of the work for their removal of it. Yes, absolutely, no question.
Let's thank Kate again.